Have you ever asked yourself, why do I always end up feeling confused, drained, and broken? Even when I thought I had finally found the one. Why does she start as everything I ever wanted? Warm, sweet, loving, only to slowly become cold, distant, unpredictable, leaving me doubting myself, questioning my own mind and wondering if I'm the crazy one. You're not crazy. You're not broken. You're not weak. But what you've been fighting against was never personal. It was something far deeper. Something few men will ever understand until it's too late. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the hidden forces that shape human behavior, especially the ones nobody talks about. The shadow, the anima, the unconscious patterns that drive attraction, love, manipulation, and destruction. And among all of his discoveries, there is one brutal truth about the feminine psyche, a truth so uncomfortable, so raw, that most modern men simply can't handle it. They ignore it. They run from it. Or worse, they fall into it over and over again, trapped in an invisible psychological game they don't even realize they're playing. In this video, you're going to uncover the brutal psychological truth Jung tried to warn every man about. Why certain women don't destroy you by attacking you. They destroy you by seducing you into abandoning yourself. And why, until you see this truth, you will keep falling for the same woman, the same pattern, the same trap, again and again. Because once you see it, really see it, the spell breaks. Forever. The illusion that traps modern men. It always begins with something deceptively simple, a feeling of connection that seems rare, intense, and almost sacred. You meet her, and suddenly the noise of the world fades. She becomes the center of your attention, your focus, your desire. Her presence feels healing, like something inside of you has finally been seen, validated and understood in a way no one else ever could. In those first moments, she seems perfect. Her sweetness, attention, and affection awaken something primal. It feels like safety, like finally arriving at a place where you can rest, where you can stop searching. But beneath that beautiful surface, an invisible mechanism is already at work. One neither of you fully understands. A psychological tension starts weaving itself into the dynamic, subtle, silent, but persistent. Slowly her energy shifts. Her warmth grows inconsistent. Affection becomes selective. Where there was presence, there is now distance. Where there was enthusiasm, there is now indifference masked as busyness or vague dissatisfaction. You begin to sense it, even if no words are spoken. Something isn't right. Something has changed. This is the precise moment where most men make the same fatal mistake. They don't listen to their body, to their instincts. They override the discomfort. They rationalize the distance. They convince themselves that maybe she's stressed. Maybe it's their fault. Maybe they need to prove themselves just a little more to bring things back to how they were. And here's the brutal truth that Carl Jung tried to expose. This pattern isn't accidental. It's not about random behavior. It's an unconscious psychological contract that began the moment attraction was formed. An unspoken agreement built on projection, the projection of the man's inner anima onto the woman, and her unconscious use of that projection as a source of power, validation, and control. This is why the love felt so intoxicating at first. It wasn't just about her. It was about the reflection of everything unhealed, unmet, and unloved within the man's own psyche. His need for validation. His longing for emotional safety. His unresolved childhood wounds that told him his worth depended on being chosen, seen, or validated by the feminine. And the more he ignores this, the deeper the trap becomes. His mind starts circling endless questions. What changed? What did I do? How do I fix this? But the answers never come, because the game was never meant to be solved at the conscious level. It operates in the shadows, where projections, unmet needs, and unconscious patterns dictate the rules. This is the silent collapse of modern men. They confuse her inconsistency with a challenge they must overcome, rather than a signal that their own lack of internal sovereignty is what placed them in this dynamic. They begin walking on eggshells, adjusting who they are to manage her moods, her silence, her unpredictable affection. And each adjustment becomes a step further away from themselves. Jung understood that the masculine psyche, when disconnected from its own center, becomes highly susceptible to the shadow feminine. Not because women are inherently malicious, but because when the feminine shadow isn't integrated, it unconsciously manipulates through withdrawal, unpredictability, and selective validation. This isn't always conscious. Often, it's simply how the shadow operates when neither side knows the rules of the unconscious. The real tragedy is that the man doesn't realize the prison he's in was one he walked into willingly. Not because he's weak, but because he never learned the difference between genuine connection and a psychological loop disguised as love. He mistook nervous system activation for passion. He confused the anxiety of inconsistency with the excitement of chemistry. And in doing so, he became trapped, not by her, but by himself. The unconscious doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't care how kind you are, how patient you are, or how much you love. It only responds to patterns. When you step into a dynamic where your peace depends on someone else's emotional stability, you have already sacrificed the very thing that could have protected you, your sovereignty. This is why modern men fall, not because they are soft, not because they are unworthy, but because they were never taught that the foundation of attraction, love, and power begins internally, not in being chosen, not in being approved of, not in chasing validation, but in the unshakable clarity of a man who knows he does not negotiate with chaos. The psychological loop you don't see until it's too late. The most dangerous part of this dynamic is how invisible it is in the beginning. On the surface, it looks like attraction. It feels like connection. But underneath, a psychological loop has already been triggered, one that operates far beneath conscious awareness. It begins the moment your mind registers her unpredictability not as a warning sign but as a puzzle. Something to solve, something to conquer. A challenge that promises, if you can just figure it out, the return of the warmth, affection, and validation you felt at the start. But the rules of this game are designed to shift endlessly. The goalposts constantly move. What worked yesterday no longer works today. Her approval becomes selective. Her affection becomes currency. And without realizing it, you enter a pattern where your nervous system learns to associate love with anxiety, desire with instability, presence with the constant fear of loss. This is not connection. It's not intimacy. It's an unconscious reinforcement of one truth. Your worth is contingent on her validation. Every compliment becomes a drug. Every withdrawal becomes a withdrawal symptom. And the more you chase, the more you shrink. The man begins adjusting, softening his words, filtering his opinions, silencing his boundaries, not because he's weak, but because his nervous system has been conditioned to believe that being chosen is survival. This is the exact moment where men either collapse into bitterness or wake up. Because the brutal truth is, you don't escape this dynamic by fixing her. You escape by facing yourself, by reclaiming the parts of you that were willing to negotiate your peace just to be chosen. And that's exactly why I created the SIM method, a simple framework to help you rebuild your clarity, integrate your shadow, and free your mind from the noise. Just 5 minutes a day, and you start cutting the invisible strings that kept you trapped. The link is in the pinned comment below. Because the painful reality is this: the game only exists if you agree to play. The moment you stop participating, the moment you stop negotiating with inconsistency, chaos, and emotional volatility, the loop collapses. Not because she changes, but because you do. Jung's entire work was built on this truth. The unconscious only controls your life until the moment you make it conscious. The patterns that once consumed you become transparent. The confusion that once felt like love now looks like exactly what it is: manipulation wrapped in the illusion of connection. And in that moment of clarity, something profound happens. You remember the man you were before the confusion, before the compromise, before the endless effort to be enough for someone whose approval was always designed to be just out of reach. This is the liberation most men never experience. Not because they can't, but because they never learned that the real war was never with her. It was with the parts of themselves that believed love must be earned at the cost of their own dignity. When you become immune to the game, there is a moment, subtle, almost anticlimactic, when the entire pattern that once consumed you collapses. Not because it changed, not because she changed, but because something inside of you finally shifted. You become immune, not in a defensive way, not out of anger, resentment, or bitterness, but because your nervous system no longer confuses unpredictability with passion. It no longer interprets inconsistency as attraction. The very fuel that once powered the game evaporates. It's not that you don't notice the tests anymore. You do. You notice the delayed replies, the sudden withdrawal of affection, the sharp shifts between warmth and cold. You hear the passive-aggressive comments, the subtle manipulations, the half-spoken threats of emotional withdrawal. But where once those things would have sent you spiraling into anxiety, overthinking, and self-blame, now they barely register. Not because you've become numb, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally remembered something the game made you forget. You were never supposed to chase clarity outside of yourself. What used to trigger panic now triggers clarity. Instead of thinking, "What did I do wrong?" your mind simply states, "This is not my problem. This is not mine to fix." Instead of spiraling into self-doubt, you experience a kind of psychological quiet, a knowing that your peace is non-negotiable, that your boundaries are not up for debate, that your worth was never supposed to depend on someone else's ability to offer consistency. And something incredible happens at this stage. The tactics lose their power. The emotional games that once felt so consuming now appear exactly as they are: small, predictable, mechanical. You begin to see how much of the relationship was never about genuine connection, but about managing the instability, confusion, and volatility that was always designed to keep you hooked. And the irony is brutal. The moment the game stops working on you, the game often escalates. She senses the shift. Maybe not consciously, but the energy changes. She feels that her withdrawal no longer triggers your chase. Her silence no longer commands your attention. Her passive aggression no longer destabilizes your nervous system. And in that space, one of two things happens. Either the chaos intensifies, desperate tests, sudden reappearances, exaggerated affection followed by immediate coldness, all designed to rehook you, or the entire dynamic implodes. The bond breaks, not with drama, not with rage, but with a quiet collapse of something that no longer has a source of fuel. The truth becomes undeniable. The pattern only ever existed because you fed it. Your desire for validation, your fear of abandonment, your confusion between emotional volatility and passion. The shadow feminine only had power because your own disconnection from self handed it to her. But once you reclaim that connection, once your peace becomes internal, not contingent on someone else's behavior, the dynamics that once consumed you become irrelevant. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you will call it fate." For most men, this pattern felt like fate, like bad luck, like a curse, like a universal law that love must always be painful, unstable, and exhausting. But it was never fate. It was never luck. It was a pattern, a loop, a psychological program running quietly in the background of your life. And the moment you see it clearly, you are free. Not because the world changed, not because women changed, but because the man who was vulnerable to that pattern no longer exists. The price you pay for abandoning yourself. Long before the heartbreak, before the confusion, before the endless spiral of trying to fix something that was never meant to be fixed, there is a decision. A silent, invisible decision that most men make without realizing. The decision to abandon themselves. Not in some dramatic, obvious way. It happens quietly, gradually, in micro moments. The moment you ignore that first uncomfortable feeling in your gut. The moment you convince yourself that the distance you're sensing is just temporary. The moment you minimize your own needs just to avoid seeming needy. The moment you silence your truth to preserve her comfort. And with each of those choices, a small part of you is traded. Your clarity, your dignity, your sense of self. You start bending, not because you are weak, but because you believe that love must be preserved at any cost. And the cost is always yourself. What no one tells you is that this is not just emotional pain. It's not just about heartbreak. The real damage happens at a psychological level. You start doubting your own perception of reality. You begin distrusting your instincts. Your nervous system becomes so entangled with her emotional volatility that you can no longer tell where her mood ends and your identity begins. You shrink. Quietly. Internally. The man you were, the man who was clear, grounded, certain, starts fading. Not because she demanded it, but because your own unconscious believed that sacrificing your truth was the price of staying connected. This is the invisible cost no one talks about. It's not just the time you wasted, not just the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the endless overthinking. It's the fracture in your own relationship with yourself. It's the moment you no longer trust your own mind. And that damage is deeper than any breakup. Because when the relationship ends, as it always does, you're left not just with the absence of her, but with the hollow space where your self-respect used to be. And that's the real grief. The grief of realizing how easily, how quietly, how willingly you gave yourself away. And it doesn't stop there. Because unless you wake up, unless you name this pattern for what it is, the next woman will be the same. Different face, different voice, same dynamic, same cycle. The shadow doesn't care about names, appearances, or circumstances. It only responds to patterns. And the man who has not yet made the unconscious conscious is destined to repeat the same story, endlessly, calling it fate, bad luck, or worse, believing that love must always hurt. But it was never love. It was never connection. It was an unconscious contract built on the belief that you must trade yourself to be chosen. A belief so deeply embedded in the psyche that most men live their entire lives without ever seeing it, until they are broken beyond recognition. And the moment you see it, truly, finally, the grief is overwhelming. But so is the liberation, because for the first time you realize the thing you were chasing was never her. It was always you. The man you become when the spell breaks. There is a precise moment, not marked by screaming, not by arguments, not by dramatic endings, but by an internal fracture where the illusion shatters. The moment when your nervous system finally stops confusing chaos with love. When your mind no longer interprets her withdrawal as a signal to prove yourself. When the silence that used to send you spiraling now lands as nothing more than confirmation of what you already know. This is not love. This is not intimacy. This is not what you were born for. Something fundamental changes. A version of yourself, the one who negotiated, minimized, filtered, tolerated, dies. Quietly. Without ceremony. The boy who learned to survive by adapting, by earning love, by shrinking himself to fit the needs of others, he's gone. And in his place, the man arrives. Not the reactive man, not the wounded man who seeks revenge or validation, but the man who is sovereign, centered, complete. A man whose peace no longer depends on anyone else's emotional stability. A man who no longer waits for permission to feel worthy, to feel clear, to feel grounded. It doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you become cold, distant, or indifferent. It means you become precise. You no longer confuse emotional volatility with depth. You no longer interpret unpredictability as passion. You stop chasing intensity and start demanding integrity. First from yourself, then from anyone who wishes to enter your life. The tests don't stop. The games don't disappear. But their power dissolves. You see them for what they are. Survival mechanisms, unconscious patterns, desperate bids for control. You no longer mistake them for love. You no longer take the bait. And when that energy meets you, when the feminine shadow tries to hook you with silence, withdrawal, passive aggression, unpredictable affection, it collides with something immovable, something unshakable, your center, your clarity, your absolute refusal to trade your dignity for the illusion of connection. And something fascinating happens in that space. The very dynamic that once consumed you becomes boring, predictable, transparent. What once felt like mystery now looks like chaos. What once felt magnetic now looks exhausting. You no longer feel the need to explain, to fix, to convince, or to negotiate with someone whose love was always conditional, transactional, and rooted in power games. Instead, you hold a simple truth, one that cannot be debated, cannot be manipulated, cannot be distorted. My peace is non-negotiable. My worth is not on trial. I do not chase confusion. I do not submit to emotional volatility. I do not abandon myself ever again. And in that truth, you become untouchable, not in the sense of being invulnerable to pain, but in the sense that the pain no longer defines you. The game no longer applies to you. The spell is broken. The man is home. At the end of everything, after the confusion, the withdrawal, the endless cycles of trying to prove, fix, negotiate, and decode, there is a realization waiting for you. A truth so uncomfortable, so liberating, so final, that once it lands, nothing ever looks the same again. It was never about her. It was always about you. She was the mirror, the projection screen, the external embodiment of everything you hadn't yet faced within yourself, every boundary you didn't hold, every truth you didn't speak, every instinct you ignored, every part of you that still believed that love must be earned through self-betrayal, through shrinking, through abandoning yourself for the illusion of being chosen. And that's the brutal truth. You weren't fighting her. You were fighting your own shadow. Your own unconscious belief that your worth depended on someone else's ability to approve of you, validate you, or stay present for you. The collapse of that illusion isn't just painful, it's devastating. Because you're not just grieving her, You're grieving every version of yourself that willingly walked into that dynamic. Every moment you knew something was wrong and ignored it. Every instinct that screamed, "Walk away," but was silenced by the fear of being alone, of not being enough, of losing something that in reality was never truly yours. But as brutal as that realization is, it's also the doorway, the portal, the threshold between the man you were, fragmented, reactive, uncertain, and the man you become, sovereign, integrated, untouchable. This is the work Jung dedicated his life to, not fixing others, not mastering manipulation, but mastering yourself, integrating your shadow, seeing the patterns clearly, and stepping out of the unconscious loops that run your life until the moment you decide they no longer do. Because here's the final truth. The game only exists if you agree to play. The chaos only controls you if you allow it. The validation only hooks you if you believe you need it. And the moment you withdraw that belief, the moment you stop participating, the entire dynamic collapses. Not with rage, not with drama, but with silence, with clarity, with the quiet knowing that you no longer belong to that version of yourself, and that version of you no longer exists. She doesn't change. The world doesn't change. But you do. And when you do, the game ends. Forever.